All right, one of the big stories in, the last few days has been the deal with New Zealand Steel, which of course is owned by a parent company in Australia that makes massive profits. We have decided in our wisdom to give New Zealand Steel around $140 million to build, as I understand, a new furnace to recycle steel. And apparently it will lead to a massive cut in this country's greenhouse gas emissions, apparently, if that's what they still call them. Is it a good deal? Is it not? Will it make any difference to anything? And are the purists right when they say if you mess with carbon pricing in New Zealand and the market, you actually destroy the effectiveness of the emissions trading scheme, which is supposedly meant to save the planet? Well, for some analysis of the deal, I thought we should go to an economist. And we are joined now by Richard Meade from the consultancy Cognitus. And he's a principal there, and he's been having a look at it. Richard, thank you for joining us. Welcome back.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning.
All right. First, can you lay out for us in layman's terms what the deal is here?
Sure, Sean. So, I'm going basically on what's been announced publicly, and apparently some details are still to be resolved. But effectively, the government's announcing that it will allocate some of the money from its GIDI funds, the Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry Fund, to help NZ Steel change some of its hardware, basically, to move from its current sort of process to a process that's more reliant on using electricity and recycling existing steel to reduce its overall emissions. And part of the deal is that there's an electricity supply arrangement coming from one of the major gentailers to supply electricity on the basis that there can be a demand response from the steel mill, which means that at times of peak demand, when electricity prices are highest, the mill could cut back its production, and that would mean that there's not placing so much peak load on the national electricity system at times when prices are generally higher, which is often when electricity is more being produced by emitting processes like gas or coal.
Okay, so Richard, I'm just clarifying, because I think these are the sorts of details that I think are important so we know what the hell we're talking about. So a commercial steel mill is getting a government subsidy of $140 million to build a new piece of equipment or plant. That piece of plant will be powered by electricity rather than some sort of smelter coal process, right? So that reduces the emissions. That reduces the emissions of New Zealand Steel.
Yeah, so we're changing the process to be less of an emitting process.
Okay, that makes perfect sense to me, Richard. My next question is, so this thing runs on electricity. How is that electricity generated? Might it be generated by coal, or is there any guarantee it won't be?
That's an excellent question, and the issue here is that even if the supply contract is from an outfit that has a great deal of hydro or other renewable generation, the problem is we have an interconnected electricity grid, so of course the electrons that come out at the time you're using them come from whichever sources are being used at the time to make electricity. So just because you contract for supply from a hydropower plant doesn't mean that the electrons reaching you are necessarily clean electrons. And for me, the question I don't quite understand myself at the moment is this demand interruption that NZ Steel has. Presumably that's for up to a certain amount of time only, but if we're in a dry winter, for example, so periodically every 7 years we have low hydro lake levels and our wholesale prices go up and we have to burn more coal or gas to
make the
up
electricity.
The shortfall.
Yeah.
Yes, unless and until we've got a much more renewable electricity system, of course, to replace that sort of thermal generation. But if we are in a dry winter, presumably the mill wouldn't shut for the whole winter. And so my concern is that the extra electricity demand that it's using, it might have shorter-term demand response, but for an extended period, which could be months over a dry winter.
So Richard, what I'm kind of hearing is we may be simply transferring part of the coal use of New Zealand Steel to a power supplier.
That's one of the possible sources of leakage, you might call it. The other one, too, apparently, is that a part of the emission savings come from increasing the blend of recycled steel in the process rather than just smelting ore or iron sands. And to the extent that recycled steel was shipped overseas to be recycled somewhere else. We're kind of moving it here, so we could be robbing Peter to pay Paul in two senses. One is keeping more steel.
The other thing I'd say is, if it was economic to spend $140 million on this new steel recycling plant in New Zealand, surely, is it BlueScope, it's called, the big Aussie parent company? They would have just done that as a good commercial decision.
I think the point is that these sorts of commercial decisions will be made over time, particularly as the sort of protection from overseas competition winds down, as the industrial allocation to NZ Steel of its NZUs under the ETS starts winding down. It'll be more trade exposed. And if we have more clean steel from overseas, that could potentially compete over here, or worse, dirty steel, so you get this leakage issue. But basically, the reason why I think there might be a rationale for doing something that involves a co-investment by government via this government investment fund is that it accelerates the process. So there'll come a point where commercially moving to a decarbonised process would be necessary, and the choices are either invest to decarbonise or shut down, of course. So that's the sort of issue that NZ Steel will be confronting at some point.
Yeah.
And so the question is, do we avoid the shutdown decision, and do we accelerate the decarbonisation decision?
Yeah. Or do we just say the whole thing's a crock anyway? But that's an argument for another day. Richard, I have talked to other economic rationalists, and I think of Oliver Hartwich from the New Zealand Initiative, who say the ETS is set up to run without interference by the government. And every time the government does something like this, a subsidy or a special deal, it actually degrades the efficiency of the ETS, which is designed to use a market price for carbon to drive efficiencies.
Yeah, there's something in that, but there's also an issue that the price from the ETS is, if you like, a marginal price. It does affect incentives to do things like changing your processes to clean them up, etc.
Yeah.
The issue is that carbon price would have to be very, very high to justify a very large investment to decarbonise your process. You could actually shut down before you decarbonise, right? Because if that's cheaper than having to invest a whole lot of money that you don't have to make a return on. So there is an issue about how much you want firms to either shut down or wait to make the decarbonisation investment later if you are in a hurry to accelerate.
I don't know why we should be in a hurry. All the warnings on global warming are being downgraded, even by the IPCC. It's remarkable. And I guess, Richard, at the end of the day, also, this money was already allocated to this fund. It's not actually extra spending, is it? It's not being taken away from health or anywhere. It was already budgeted for.
That's probably true. I understand the fund is partly funded from the consolidated fund, so there's always a question of what misses out if that money wasn't used for somewhere else.
But it was already allocated for this fund.
An existing fund, that's right.
Yeah. So in that way, it's not new or extra spending. And I guess New Zealand Steel looks at it and says, we've got a nice, bright new piece of kit. It keeps us in business a little longer, or it's never bad when the government gives you money, is it?
I think from NZ Steel's perspective, this has to be a good outcome because they can decarbonise and stay in business and not have to foot the whole bill, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, Richard, thank you so much for walking us through that. I understand the deal a hell of a lot better than I did 10 minutes ago. So I thank you very much indeed for your time. Richard Meade, who is the principal at Cognitus Consultancy. See, I thought my reading of it was that somehow we were paying them not to... Well, I suppose we are paying them not to use coal for their processes, but they're now going to use electricity which may be made with coal. So what is the frickin' difference? What is the difference, I wonder? And I just can't see any. So it looks like it's all smoke in the mirrors, doesn't it? Ben, can you figure this out, Ben, just as a layperson?
In economic terms, not particularly. I can understand the publicity behind it.
Yeah.
But there needs to, you're right, there needs to be some sort of clarification about where that replacement energy is coming from. And we've seen the same thing with climate action before.
Unless there's a prohibition, and you can't tell if it's coal or not, electricity is just electricity once it's been generated, as he pointed out. Odd.